So with that, I'll introduce our panelists. And I also want to thank them for being here tonight. We really appreciate it. So closest to me, we have Dr. Jason Gold. He's a clinical psychologist and psychoanalyst with a focus on adolescents ages 12 to 25 and their families. Dr. Gold works with adults, couples, and younger children as well. His office is on the Upper West Side of Manhattan and in Armonk. 15 years experience in private practice. Dr. Gold provides consultations, psychotherapy, psychoanalysis, and comprehensive psychoeducational evaluations, as well as clinical supervision. In addition to his private practice, he is the consulting psychologist for the middle and upper schools at Riverdale Country School. He works with students, parents, and faculty on emotional and behavioral well-being, serves as a consultant to the learning research team, supporting students with learning differences. And as a clinical supervisor, Dr. Gold supervises students in the doctoral programs in clinical psychology at CUNY and the New School for Social Research. Externs and interns in clinical psychology at the New York Psychoanalytic Institute and psychiatry residents at the Mount Sinai School of Medicine Department of Psychiatry. In the middle is the Reverend Dr. Martha Jacobs. She's the senior minister at the First Congregational Church in Chappaqua. Prior to coming there, she served for more than 15 years as a chaplain in the New York City area hospitals, was a disaster response chaplain in New York City following 9/11, was certified as a member of the spiritual response team that is part of the critical response team for the National American Red Cross, was president of the New York Disaster Interfaith Services and coordinator for the United Church of Christ Disaster Chaplains. She's a contributing author for Psychological First Aid, Field Operations Guide for Community Religious Professionals, created by the National Child Traumatic Stress Network and National Center for PTSD, which was published in 2006. At the far end of the table is Dr. Leanne Nelson. She's the chief psychologist and director of the Treatment Center for Trauma and Abuse at Westchester Jewish Community Services. Dr. Nelson received a PhD in clinical psychology from the New School for Social Research. Completed a postdoctoral fellowship at New York Presbyterian. She's the co-chairwoman of the Westchester County Trauma Task Force since its inception, and is a member of the multidisciplinary team in Westchester, the Child Advocacy Center Steering Committee, and the Batterers Advisory Committee at WILC. In recent years, she has presented on vicarious trauma, Trauma 101, evidence-based trauma treatment, the impact of trauma on agency, and the impact of trauma on substance abuse, among other trauma-related topics. And I will also mention Dr. Nelson has been working with our school district this year on that as a consultant. So I will ask the first question, which I believe Dr. Gold is going to field that. And then
can we chime in like with each other?
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Well, I should say. Yeah. I mean, I'm not doing
if you're okay with that. So the first question/topic is this. As a parent, how should we decide when to initiate a conversation with a younger child, elementary school or younger, about disturbing current events? What characteristics should we be looking for in our child that indicates they might be ready to discuss? And conversely, is there something we should be looking for that indicates they are not ready for certain conversations? And what factor does possible exposure from outside sources, such as social media, older siblings, and peers at school, play, if any, in that decision? Should I break it up?
One question. I'm going to be like a politician. I'm just going to say what I was planning to say anyway. Anyhow, no, I want to thank you, Chris, for inviting me to be on this panel tonight. And I think that we're all, and please do jump in, but I think we're all going to offer some guidelines on about how to talk to children and teens about scary or upsetting events. And we're going to have some rules of thumb, things that you might keep in mind, but based on age or about what you know about your child, about their temperament. But I want to emphasize that they're all rules of thumb, and that every situation is going to be a little bit different, and that you as the parents, know your children best. And in saying that, I mean that you know how they're most likely to respond to something that you might have to tell them. The other thing I want to mention is that it's not like you say something once and that's the end of it. So you tell a story, you bring something up, and you're going to have multiple opportunities to talk about this with your children. If you say too much at a certain point, or you feel like you've said too little, you can come back to it. There'll be opportunities to course correct. And there's no one conversation that you have or you don't have that's going to land a child on my couch or anybody else's.
Takes 4 or 5 conversations.
Yeah, give or take, right? And I think that starting to get to the questions, I think the approach that you take is going to be different depending on if it's an event that only you know about, or it's an event that you suspect your child has heard about, or if it's an event that you know that your child's heard about. And of course, it's going to be different if it's an event that is going to have a direct impact on your child. And so to get at the first question about when to initiate a conversation about with your children about something scary or upsetting, I'll give a few examples, and maybe people have other thoughts too. The first thing that I thought of is that if the child asks, right? So if your child comes to you and has a question about something, you want to follow their lead. So if they're asking, they want to know. And if they're asking, that means that they're ready to know something about it. It doesn't mean that you're going to tell them everything about a story, but it means that you're going to tell them something. When my 6-year-old daughter came home from school one day and said, Daddy, what does divorce mean? Right? So she was ready to know. She had heard this somewhere in school, and she wanted to know something about that. She was curious. So we told her something about it. If you know that the child has heard something or will hear a story about an event, so if you get an email from the principal saying that there was a lockdown drill in the school that day, you might later on that evening over dinner or something say, I heard that there was a lockdown drill in school today. And then pause and wait and see what the response is. And maybe that's it. Maybe they say yes. Maybe they say yes and they add something. Maybe they say, you wouldn't want to go really far into it until you knew that they wanted to know more about it. The lockdown drill might be scary for us, but to them it might have been exciting. It might have been something that they didn't quite know about, but they were curious about. And so you give them a little bit of information, you see how they process it, and then you can add more or not. If you become aware of a situation that you know will directly impact your child. So if there's somebody in the family who might be ill, or if a grandparent is likely to die soon, then you want to bring that up with your child, and you don't want to, because if your child feels like you're avoiding something that they know is there, then they get the message that somehow this is something that you're not supposed to be talking about, or something to avoid, and so you don't want to give them that impression. Another example, if they repeat something that they have heard. So my son came back from after school one day, he's 8, and he said, in after school today, one of my friends said, ISIS is going to blow everybody up. So we had to pause and say, well, okay. And he kind of had, he was curious. He had a little bit of a smile on his face, but he wasn't quite sure what it meant. And so we asked him a little bit more about it. Later on, when he said he wanted to join ISIS, we gave a little bit more information, so we knew that that was something that, if somebody in real life wanted to, blow somebody up, it would injure or even kill people, and so you don't want to say that you want to join ISIS. Sometimes the situations aren't entirely clear, so another short story that my family was driving downtown in Manhattan maybe a few months ago to visit my brother, and they're all the way downtown, and in doing so we were going to drive past One World Trade. And we're driving down, we weren't even thinking about it that much, but as we get closer, we see the building in front of us. My wife and I look at each other, we think, is this an opportunity to bring up what happened on September 11th? We didn't. And then my son sees the building and he says, wow, look at that building. What if that building comes crashing down on us? Let's get out of here, right? And we look at each other again and we think, now do we tell him something about it? And again, we didn't, but we chose not to. Now, in retrospect, it might have been, I've thought about it, I thought we could have asked him something like, have you heard this somewhere? Have you heard about buildings falling down? Or have you, just to get a sense of where he was or where this was coming from for him. At that point we didn't, but we'll get another chance. Okay, and then just to, I guess there was another question about how to tell if a child is or is not ready to hear about an event. And I think I've covered some of that. If they ask, they're ready to hear something about it. But I just want to go back to that point that you know your child best. And so if you know that your child tends to be anxious, let's say, and if they hear stories and those stories stay with them and it makes it hard for them to go to sleep at night, and you know that it's likely to do that, then maybe even if you're going to present them some information, which you will want to, you're going to want to present it in smaller chunks, in little bits that they could digest, and then let them come back to you. And so it might, if you know that your child is more anxious, you might want to pace things differently than you would if a child is more inquisitive and really wants to know the information and needs to know something more in order for them to feel more settled. So maybe I'll sort of pause there. There are handouts. Did we give out those handouts?
We didn't give them out, but leave them on the table.
Yeah, so there are handouts that I think a bunch of us have given out where there are some guidelines for talking to children of different ages about upsetting events. And you can look those over, but
Is there, I think the kids are much more perceptive than we often give them credit for. So waiting for even a small child to bring something up doesn't mean, and if they don't, doesn't mean that they don't sense a conversation at home or your mood or energy or talk, they sort of start floating around. So it seems to me like proactively bringing heavy stuff up would be there's value in it. Right?
That's a great question.
It's a great question.
I just want to piggyback sort of on what you were saying about how it can be a really fine line, right? Because if we don't talk about things, then we can communicate to our children that it's too scary to talk about, we can't handle it, and so on and so forth. But I also think that I have two kids, 19 and 21, and my daughter and I text, and I told her that I was going to be coming here last night and the night before, and I sort of explained the outline, and I said, is there anything that you would like me to communicate? And she said, yeah, you way overshared. So even someone who really tries to sort of find that true mean.
Yeah, I'm totally oversharing that.
Yeah. But on the other hand, I don't think it's a sin to err on the side of giving your kid information. Martha?
Well, I think that one of the things that that's important is to answer the question they ask. Don't get ahead of them with where do you think they're going with their question. Take it at face value of what the question is and just answer that very narrow question, and then if they have a follow-up question, then you can move on to that. Because I think what happens is, at least I know when I work with a confirmation class, I have a really difficult time stopping myself and thinking, I wonder where they're going with this question, and what do I have to be prepared for, instead of just stopping at and answering that specific question and letting them have that kind of, soak in a little bit, and then letting them say, but what if? And then continue the conversation, but to remain where they are and not try to project where I hope or think they might go, because inevitably they go down a totally different road than I thought they were going to go.
And
So-
I agree with that too, because I think it's really important to make sure that you ask your child sort of what their question means. Because I don't, in my experience as a parent and as a psychologist, there's been times when someone's asked me a question and I'm like, oh yeah, I'm on this, but I know exactly what you're talking about. And then I realize like, oh man, like, that was not really what they were asking. So sort of, what do you mean by that? Or is there something that's concerning you about that? Sometimes can provide.
What if their question is something that you really do not, that you don't want to answer?
Why wouldn't you want to answer?
Well, if it's just something that maybe is you think they're too young to hear about it, or it's just something that, that's very disturbing, you don't want them to hear it because they're too young. I mean, where's the line between kind of, fudging the truth or, I can give you an example. Like when my cat died, we, have the ashes in a box, and my son was like, he used to be this big, how did he get to be this big? And I didn't really want to explain to him what they did to him. So how do you kind of get around those things?
Cat question.
Right. I mean, that's just an example. Right.
That's great.
I think I would probably tell them. I think I would probably tell a child how that happened. Yeah.
Okay.
And that they died, and that their life there was no more life left in the cat's body, and so this is what you did, and this is a way to preserve it and to have it there with you as a memory.
Right.
Yeah, I would agree. I don't think you need to go through the details.
Yeah, no,
The
he really
temperature
wanted to
settings.
know that. Like, we
Yeah,
understood,
well,
he was
yeah.
okay with the death part, he just
Yeah.
wasn't okay with the
shrinking.
ashes
The
part.
shrinking process after death.
It makes me think that there are some kids that in their anxiety will sort of get excited and will want to, there's something, this line between what is anxious, what is exciting, what is overstimulating, I think is sort of a fine line also. And so there you want to give some information, but if you feel like it's starting to get into an overstimulating situation, then you want to find a way to tone it down a bit.
What do you do when you're in a situation where one of your children wants to go to a place in conversation where the other one doesn't? And I know that that's a little hard to understand, so I'll give you my actual example. My two children are both adopted, and they were both adopted from Korea. And I am adopted, so adoption stories are real common on our house. And my daughter said, do you know my birth mother? At the dinner table. And my son was like, if he could have crawled under the plate, he totally would have. But Caroline was like, let's talk about this. What do you do in that situation when one child really wants to forge ahead and the other child is like, why are we even going here? Like, I didn't want to avoid, because there's nothing to be ashamed of, but what do you do?
I think naming it. And saying, so-and-so doesn't seem to be comfortable right now with this conversation. Maybe you and I could have this conversation, or, just the two of us later. I think kids are okay with that. And I think it's okay to model also care for your son who wasn't really comfortable with that.
Yeah.
He's not comfortable with that, so let's hold off on that.
How do you handle when your children find out about disturbing situations when you're not prepared for them to know, or you haven't been told they're going to find out, and it's from a reputable source, whether it be from another child's parent, from a school, from a religious leader? How do you step back and sort of tell them your tale once they've been told a different tale? You know what I'm saying? How do you tell it your way, the way you want them to know it, versus the way they've been told it? I could give a clear example. My daughter was told in school about 9/11 from her teacher when she was in first grade. And to me, that was something that I experienced and I was involved in, and I wanted to share with her my way. And so it was very difficult, and it's still, to this day, that it's pervasive in her life, the difference in how mommy and daddy were there on 9/11 and truly affected by it, and how she was told it sort of like as a story, as like a historical story. So how do you, I mean, we're still working through it, she's in 6th grade. So how do you take that 1st grader or that 3rd grader and say like, okay, well this is the, you know, how we want you to see the story.
That's not in my bailiwick, it's yours.
Yeah, that's, I mean, my first reaction is to be angry at the 1st grade teacher.
Well,
Yeah.
you know, that's a whole other story, but you know, that's over now. That principal's no longer there, so let's move on and then talk about how we feel with our child, who still is affected by the fact that, you know, there's 2 different versions of how she hears 9/11.
So the first version was, this was some event that happened, it was
It was a
somewhere
terrorist
far
attack,
away.
yeah. And our version is like, this really affected us, this is what happened,
Yeah.
buildings fell, our friends were killed, like
Yeah.
this is, you know, this is a personal tragedy as much as it is, you know, a
Yeah.
historical tragedy.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think, again, I would sort of approach it gradually, and so, you know, the initial response, wow, and here, you know, when you personally, as a parent, are affected by something in a way that it, you know, gets at you deeply in an emotional way, it becomes very hard, because you don't want to hide that, but you also don't want to overwhelm your child with the intensity of the feeling. And so to say something like, you know, mommy and daddy know about it, not only do we know about it, but we were really affected by it, and then to maybe leave it there and sort of give it some time and see what she comes back with. And so it sounds like you've been doing that.
I'm asking because I have a 1st grader now, and I'm just preparing myself, and do we, we're not ready for him to hear about it, but maybe we have no choice but to sort of bring it up our way.
Yeah.
I think that's a really, oh, no,
Go-
go ahead.
no, no.
I think that's a really important point, because I think that sometimes our children also get information, especially not necessarily in 1st grade, but certainly my kids are 19 and 21, and I certainly saw, you know, I don't know what it is now. It's like 6th grade kids get cell phones, or maybe it's earlier now. It was 6th grade when they were, and I think that our children have so many sources of information that it's really hard to assume that they have not heard something about it,
Right.
about whatever it is.
I was going to say, to your point, 5th grade, my daughter's in 5th grade, she did not have a phone, but this year I preemptively brought up 9/11, right before 9/11, and I'm so glad I did, because she told me she watched the video of the buildings fall on the bus to school on somebody else's device. And so she didn't have, that was the whole, how, you know, she wasn't going to bring it up, because I think it wasn't on her radar, but we knew they were going to discuss it in social studies that day. And she even came home discussing how funny it was that the teacher was tearing up, which is odd for a child to see a teacher cry at school. I get that that's hard to process, and a lot of times kids will go towards, haha, that person was crying. And so I didn't think she was being disrespectful or being any, but we did discuss that these are real emotions and real things, blah, 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 and all that. But I have been feeling that through social studies, especially, that maybe I need to be a little more preemptive, because today at dinner we discussed the Flint, Michigan water crisis, and it's like, are you 10? Yeah, you're 10, okay. And, but my heart, you know, it was just one of those things, because you never know when someone's going to pull out a cell phone. And I just have to say, I just told a 7-year-old and a 10-year-old what cremation was, because my mom's cat died.
Okay.
Yeah, so, I'm like, oh.
Winner, how do you do that?
I know.
You can come to my house.
Because my mother asked if we could keep the ashes at our house.
Okay.
Yeah, we had that discussion as well.
I have a question that's kind of related to this, you're telling things your way. When you're suffering a personal crisis, so if a parent has died, or there's someone near you that's committed suicide, or something like that, so you are personally overcome, how do you handle that with your children? I mean, you know, this happened to me, and I went crazy, and, you know, I mean, I was just so overcome and so distraught. I wasn't even thinking about how I was affecting myself. And I'm sure that, you know, I mean, I kind of carry this guilt, like, maybe I damaged him somehow by not controlling, my reactions in front of him. Do you have any advice?
There are
for
so many
parents?
more ways of damaging children than having honest emotional
Yeah.
experiences.
And I think as long as you let your child know that you're okay, you're very upset, you're very sad, and you're showing him or her how you're reacting, and that it's normal and natural to feel that way, that then it makes it easier for them. I've watched more older people in the ER not be able to deal with their grief because as children, and these are adults, as children they were told, do not cry, do not do this, do not do that, do not feel. And so they're carrying all of the grief that they've had through their whole life because they haven't been able to express it. So if we can show our own feelings and talk about them to our kids, it normalizes it. Yes, mommy's really upset. The first time I saw my mother cry, I thought, it was like the end of the world. And then she sat me down and she said, here's why I'm crying. I'm very upset because your grandmother just died, and even though I didn't know her very well, it affected me because it was affecting my mother. So it was easier for me to kind of hear that and accept that and know that it was okay to cry. That even adults cry and get angry and, do all of those things, and that's a normal part of being a human being.
I think that, there's a lot of talk in our profession about how you handle it when you as a parent are feeling very emotional yourself. And I think there's a little bit of a problem with it because I think there's this idea that there's some ideal way of handling these situations, and there is no ideal way. You felt something and you felt it intensely, and it happened. It's not like and that's real. That's why I said we have these guidelines and these rules of thumb and these ways that we say, okay, well, it's better if the parent can sort of try to process some of the more intense feelings themselves and then present it in a more metabolized way to the child. But I don't think that's so realistic
Right.
a lot of the time.
I think also, like,
Oh, sorry.
You
Martha's-
go ahead.
Martha- No, go ahead.
If you're not ready to talk about something too, you can also say to your kids, like, I'm really upset right now and we're gonna talk about this tonight. And
Sure.
just give yourself that time to grieve yourself when you're dealing with something so traumatic. And I think your kids can understand that,
But it is important to then
Yeah,
have that conversation.
follow it up. But
To
you
follow
can-
it up and not just
and
like try
sometimes
to
if they
sweep
ask
it.
like a question about cremation, you can say, we're gonna talk about that later. And as long as you're honest and do talk about it later, and then you can kind of think about how you want to do it, talk to friends, get other advice, and then come up with a plan. But sometimes I find my best answer is, I don't know yet. And I can say that to my daughter, and she trusts me that I'm going to come back to her and not just, that doesn't mean we never talk about it.
Right. I think it is important to be able to say to your child, I don't know the answer to that either. Why don't we see if we can find the answer together? Or let's call so-and-so and see if they can help us figure out the answer. Because we don't have to have the answers, right? We just have to be able to kind of sit with the questions. And that was probably the hardest thing for me to do in my training as a chaplain, was not to feel like I had to know the answers. Because I didn't have to know the answers. I just had to be able to sit with the person in their distress and help them kind of solve it for themselves. Just by asking them further questions or just sitting in silence for a little while. But to be able to say, I don't know the answer to that. Let's figure it out together. It is also a good way for parents and children to kind of discover new things together. You had a comment?
Actually, I have a question, so.
Go for it.
So, my kids, they're 7 and 8, and they ask a lot of questions, and they get really deep into the topic. So, on the cat and the cremation story, we lost a cat recently, and we had
New special.
Yes, really?
So we got really deep into the conversation because they wanted to know, he was euthanized and how did that process work and all these. So we have deeper conversations with our kids than I think a lot of other kids maybe the same age would have. And this is across the board, not just with the cat guys. But how do we tell our kids, don't go share the depth of knowledge that you now have with your friends, because their friends maybe aren't ready to hear it, and especially not from them, to kind of help, let the parents have these conversations with their kids instead of my kids explaining how euthanasia works.
I think it's very dicey sometimes to tell kids don't go do this, right? Because sometimes then they're like, ooh, this is really, really exciting. Because my mother said, don't go and share this information. So there must be something dangerous or exciting or edgy about this information. So that can be really tough. I empathize with you about that, being the oversharer that I was with my children.
Well, I do think that you could say that, in our home, these are things that we talk about. But it might be the case that in other people's homes, they might not talk about it in the same way that we do. And, your friend might be upset if he heard all of these details. Something about the impact that it might have on another child. Not that it's going to get them to not do it. You can't prevent it, but...
Yeah, I agree with you. That was something that I know I'm here because I'm a psychologist, but I'm also a mom, we would have conversations about, in our family, this is what we do. In our family, this is what we find important. We don't use those words in our family, that sort of thing, to just really develop that family culture. So that was helpful.
I can give you a very good example. We were in a like a gas station restroom on a road trip, and my son walked into the bathroom, and immediately, I'd been in there before, I knew exactly what I was going to see, and immediately started laughing hysterically. There's a condom machine, so descriptive. I mean, all these, and I knew it. And so there was another mother standing. I said, "Well, just finish up, come out, we'll discuss it." And there was another mother standing with her same age son, 12, and she said, "There's something funny in there." I said, "It's just a condom machine," and she's like, her son started talking. She's like, "Don't talk to me about that. I'm not your friend." And so when he came out and he wanted to discuss it, I said, "You know what? Not everybody's comfortable with this subject. I'm happy to answer any questions you have and discuss with you, but let's wait till we get in the car." And so that's what we did.
Very nice.
But it was totally different, polar, responsive, and I thought it was good for him to see that. So.
It's a great example.
Are there any other questions from the floor? Our plan format sort of went out the window, but that's fine. This is great. This is really great. You can still pass up your index cards. I'll still be feeling shy. So I'm going to ask, I think we've already got into one of the other planned questions in some of these answers, but maybe we can get another conversation started with this one. So looking more at middle and high school students, if you know your middle or high school child has been exposed to disturbing information or distressing incident that is not public, it's very personal, but they haven't confided it in you, what do you do with that information? Either, and just to set the stage, maybe a parent has heard from their child's friend's parent that something happened, or they were looking at their phone or Facebook account and saw something, knows their child has seen it, knows it must be disturbing, it's disturbing to the parent. How, do you initiate a conversation, I guess, and if so, how?
That's my question, and I'm going to back into it because that's how I need to set this up for you. I work with 12 and 13-year-olds in the confirmation class, and we talk about, a range of things from God to Jesus to sin and forgiveness and what it means when somebody hurts you or you hurt somebody else. And I've written down notes only because if I don't, I'll kind of go all over the place. So, sometimes we have really amazing conversations, and I think the reason that we do that is because I've established a no judgment zone. in this room with these young people. So they can say what they think and what they feel, and I'm not going to judge them for it. I may question them further, and they have the right to say, no, I don't want to go there, and I'll say, okay, fine, and let's move on. But the fact that I've established this kind of safe space for them, they will sometimes talk about more difficult issues than they would otherwise. And in fact, in their evaluation about confirmation class, one of the things they talk about is that their ability to give their opinion and not be judged because they've given their opinion. So each group is different in this, but there are several things that I think are very similar. The first is that sitting in silence once you ask a question is a really important thing, because kids need time to think of their answers. And I mean, if we think about it for us, when we have a confusing situation, we often need time to process. How do we say this to our child? How do we talk about this? And so sitting in silence, while it may be very uncomfortable for us, I think is really important for our youth, because it does give them a chance to kind of focus in on what they want to focus on. Several of the youth have told me that they're always being judged about what they say and how they say it. So they take time to really think about what they're going to say, and so by establishing this kind of no judgment zone, they don't have to say it so carefully. So often I can ask them something and they'll answer much more spontaneously because they know they're not being judged. And they say that sometimes that the things that they want to talk about, they're not asked for their opinion. They're asked more for book knowledge, for reading knowledge, for those kinds of things, but not how they feel or think about something. And that's what I've tried to do with them, is give them that opportunity to actually think and talk about what they feel and what's going on inside of them. Last year, for example, when the news came out about ISIS was recruiting young people, our group had a conversation about that. And I asked them, what do you think? Do you think you'd be open to being recruited? You know, do you think you'd go? What would you do? And we really had a very thought-filled conversation about that. And I was really surprised at the depth of their ability to kind of process and think about, really, you know, this would not be a really good thing to do. And you know, aside from the, oh, I don't want to leave my mom and dad, to, you know, to I really think that what they're doing is wrong. And they actually were able to have conversations about that. So I think that, you know, seeking their opinion about the world and what they see happening in the world then makes it easier, I think, to then begin to have those conversations when more difficult things arise. Because you've already set up that opportunity, at least in some instances, to have a no judgment zone, where you're not going to judge them for what they say or what they think or how they feel. And because they feel so judged so much of their time and so much of their life, they feel judged constantly in school. They feel judged certainly on the sports field and in all of the activities that they do after school. So it's a lot of pressure on them to be good and to say the right thing. So it's really important, I think, to set up the chance to have like a no judgment zone. And that's often hard for us. And I think there's one experience that came up that I wanted to share. We were talking about our church's mission and how we help the least of these. And I asked, these were all guys, I asked them, so who are the least of these in your world? In your everyday world, who are the least of these for you? And one youth mentioned that there was a child in his class that was being picked on all the time. I asked him to tell me more about it, and he said that there were times that this child was being pushed around by the other kids, but that he had stepped in and had stopped it. And I asked him why he did that, and he said because it was wrong to pick on somebody, and that then he had befriended him and he made sure that he walked with him between classes after that. He said he had learned in church that he was to care about somebody who was in need, and he saw that this other child was really in need. I asked him how he felt about helping this child out, And he said it felt good to help him, and now, by the way, he had a really good friend, and they both liked each other, and that was a really good thing that happened. And I asked him if he then told any adults about what had happened, and he said no. I asked if he would have told adults if the kids had continued to pick on this child, and he said, well, maybe, but I think I could handle it. But he also added that he didn't want to get the other kids in trouble for their, as he said, acting so stupid. So I commended him for what he had done, and we went on to talk about how a bad situation was turned into a good situation, and that now we had a new friend. And then we also discussed that sometimes it's the choices that we make in life that make a difference, and the importance of talking over those choices with parents or people that you trust. So I didn't judge him for not telling an adult about the bullying. However, I did make sure I reinforced with him the importance of talking about it when, talking over those kinds of choices that you make with either a parent or someone else that you trust. I think I said earlier that it's best not to second guess when your child asks a question, where they're going with it. Because we as human beings, we need to understand why things happen, right? We're always asking, why did this happen? Why did so-and-so die? Why did this happen? Why did that happen? I think even little kids who ask why don't know why they're asking why, but still it's a way that they need to find meaning in life. And so it is important that it's natural to ask the questions and important to try to help kids find some answers to them. And lastly, I think that what's important, as I learned from these youth, is not to minimize their feelings. If they say something, try not to say back to them, don't feel that way. Or you shouldn't feel that way. Or try not to feel that way. Because you're dismissive of their feelings. And they're trying to tell you what they're feeling. And you're saying to them, oh, don't bother with that. Don't worry about that. Instead of saying, well, I hear you're angry, or I hear you're upset. And I've been that way too, and it's really an opportunity to share your own feelings, as I mentioned earlier, with what you're going through. And you've heard the story, and I said to this young man who told about the bullying, I said, well, I would have been really scared to get in between, these kids that were messing around. Why weren't you scared? So he said, well, I was scared, but I thought it was an important thing to do. And I said, okay. So I think my being able to share with him that I would have been scared helped him to claim that he was scared, but also that he felt, a higher calling, as it were, to do something for somebody else that was in need. And so I think we really have to, as adults, really model for young people better ways to do things and better ways to talk about things. When you express your feelings without judgment, it also helps them to be able to express their own feelings without feeling like they're being judged. So does that kind of answers that question in some ways?
I think we were actually both assigned this question.
Were we?
I think we were.
Because you're doing it for older kids.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, you got the.
I got the teenage.
Oh.
The young teens.
Okay. So, from a more clinical perspective,
Yes.
although Martha and I have discussed and Jason have discussed how there really isn't so much different between people of the faith and people who do mental health, there's a few points that I'd like to make, though, about kids in general and also older kids. And one I think is really important is that our kids really want to protect us from any knowledge that they may be in danger or that bad things may have happened to them. And I think it's really important just to note that. And this may vary according to child age, but I think it's kind of a universal truth. And the other important thing is that kids are designed to think that they're responsible for everything, or that everything that happens to them, that they were the cause. And there's an important, it's a developmental process, and children evolve over their lives. But it's normal for kids to think that they're responsible for everything that happens to them.
I'm sorry, can you just elaborate what you mean with when you say they want to protect us by telling something upsetting that's happened to them? Or not telling. Or not, right, or not telling.
Yeah. I think that we think of ourselves as being their protectors. So I think it's important just to acknowledge that they also feel, because they feel responsible for, they really think that they're responsible for so many things that are really not in their control. And this is particularly highlighted because, you know, the program I run at WJCS is for trauma survivors. So this is something that we just see again and again and again and again. So I think it's just important for us to know somewhere in the back of our minds that our kids want to protect us as well. So that can be an important conversation, is really making sure that they know that you can handle it if something has happened to them, and making sure that you don't freak out.
Well, yeah, I wanted to add, protect us from having some sort of a strong, upsetting, negative, emotional reaction to something that they might tell us.
That's a very important component to it. But I think because that they think they're responsible for so much that we know as adults they're not responsible for. But that's one of the most heartbreaking things, I think, when you're talking about children who have been traumatized, is that kids will find a million different ways of making sense about it, and part of their making sense about it, or I think we share probably not wanting to live in a world where bad things happen for no reason. So kids will make themselves a central part of the reason why certain things happened, and I just want to put that out there. And I think it's important that if you have a child who had a personal trauma, that you say over and over and over again, it was not your fault, you were not responsible, it was not your fault, you were not responsible. And I think that that's part of why kids can be vulnerable. Even older kids can feel vulnerable in situations where there may have been abuse or some sort of, interpersonal trauma, because they will make themselves feel like they're responsible. So, sorry, my kids also say I'm Debbie Downer, so I'm really sorry. Abuse and trauma. Oh, God, Mom, really? So then I'm going to switch a little bit over to social media. So I know, I said already, my kids are 19 and 21, so I have had the impulse to look at their phone, and I have looked at their Facebook. It's just real. Some parents insist that their kids can't be on social media unless they friend them or allow them access or whatever that is. The problem with that strategy, it does work sometimes, but I am a 49-year-old woman, and my kids are so much more technologically savvy than I am. I cannot even try to keep up with them. And one time, my daughter was 21. She was about 16. She friended me on Facebook with a completely fake page. And I was like, really? She used her nickname. There were like 2 posts. I was like, I know you're 16. There's more than 2 posts. Let's just, let's stop the pretense. Now that she's older, we are truly Facebook friends, and I check her Instagram, and she checks mine, and so on and so forth. And parents are very connected on social media. So in terms of the question about, what are your options if you suspect that your child knows about something or has been affected by something, then I generally advocate, especially if your child is or has been in any particular danger, saying, I snooped, I looked, and this is what I found out. And I'm telling you, I'm being completely honest about it because I think this is important. If you don't want to go that route, you generally can pass it off on another, I heard from another mom that such and such happened, and did this happen to you, and is this something you want to talk about? And I think, I know my kids fussed and hollered and, oh my God, privacy, and, I can't believe you, blah, blah, blah. And, that's true, but I also think that a lot of times kids make a big, huge fuss as sort of a red herring. And they really sort of need a little bit of time to process that you know about this thing that they've been trying to protect you by not telling you about, or, what have you. And sometimes you can be distracted by that, but I think it's beside the point. And especially if their safety is at issue, I don't really care. I mean, that's my bottom line as a mom and as a psychologist. And I think that often what happens is there can be this initial sort of Sturm und Drang and oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. But I think that a lot of times that kids will really be taking a look at your reaction, and if you're not freaking out, then a lot of times they'll be reassured that they know that they can have this conversation with you. So therefore, I think it's really important to really pull yourself together. If we are thrown off as parents by something, it's really important to pull ourselves together before we initiate any conversations that might be emotional for us or for our children. And the last point I want to make is that it's also really important to acknowledge that teenagers sometimes will just not give you any reaction. And they will want to act like they're not affected whatsoever. I don't even know why you'd ask me that question, Mom. Of course I'm not, don't have any reaction. Or they can act angry or indifferent. And that doesn't mean that you did a bad job bringing up the conversation. It's their way of sort of protecting themselves and sort of figuring it out, like, okay, what is the situation? And sometimes they need the information, but they can't acknowledge it to you in that moment.
I think another part that I always find fascinating about the brain, and you can correct me if I learned this incorrectly, is that you can't think and feel at the same time, right? So if you are in the midst of a fight, and when I do premarital counseling, I talk about this. Which one of you cries, which one of you yells?
Yeah.
And because it's almost always,
So
and the sex doesn't matter, I mean, not that sex doesn't matter, but the gender, thank you, doesn't matter. Sex matters, yes, sex matters. But you can't rationalize something when you're feeling something, right? So one party is saying, but can't you just understand that I need you to understand this, and the other one's crying or upset, cannot hear it. It's like a child, right? Children are throwing a tantrum, and you're trying to explain to them why you have to go home because it's time for dinner, and they can't hear you and can't understand it. So trying to have that rational conversation when they're so emotional is not helpful. It doesn't work. So I always suggest to couples that they take a timeout from each other. Give yourself 5 or 10 minutes, calm down, the anger goes down, the tears go away, and then you can come together and have a conversation. And I think that's the same between parents and children, that when the emotions are going, you can't have a rational conversation. You can't. So it's better to say, you know what, I need 10 minutes to think about this, and let's come back together in 10 minutes and talk. And then give yourself that time to really come down. Go get a drink of water, take a walk around the house, something, and then sit down and have a rational conversation. Because it's not going to be, you're not going to get through otherwise. It's just going to, the emotions are just going to keep going higher and higher, and then you start saying things that you don't mean instead of, sitting and having a conversation.
I just want to go back to your social media thing. So in our house, we have a rule that until you pay for your own devices, everything's public. So you don't have to friend me because I have your passwords, and on a regular basis, whenever I feel like it, or maybe never, I will either look or not look, or be involved or not be involved. And I'm getting from you that may not be a good thing. So I sort of.
I think that sometimes I feel like it's kind of an illusion that we are really going to have complete access to all of our children's stuff.
Okay. So how do you handle that if you find out that you don't? Like, if you don't.
Yeah. Well, then
my immediate reaction is to be like, okay, well now you don't have anything, and give it back to me. And,
or
I'm going to school tomorrow.
I would just say that there have been times when my kids are older than your kids, obviously, but there have been times when I've just said I really need access to that. I'm really not comfortable with you being on that site, and I'm going to sit here and I'm going to just bore you by telling you all that I know about this site and why it's dangerous and so on and so forth and blah 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 blah. Because I'm a talker. Right. I mean, if something's going on, I'm more inclined to point it out and say, oh, I see this is happening. I worry sometimes that some of the parents, I have them as friends and I've worked with them, who have these, these devices and the computers and so on and so forth. I just have seen kids who have just been able to figure them out. I mean, I worked with a young boy who was doing stuff he shouldn't have been doing on the internet that was very scary, and he had completely evaded his father. I cannot even make this up. His father was in IT, and his father had this program that was supposed to give him access to all of his child's stuff. And granted, this was a few years ago, but this boy had found a way of getting to the internet using devices that one does not usually associate with connected to the internet. So I just worry sometimes, you know, we develop a false sense of security.
Yeah, for some kids, it becomes a game, you know, you try to, make it so that I can't get past that, they're going to try to get past it. But it makes me think, back before the internet, if a child had a diary or a journal, it might be something that a parent wouldn't really want to intrude on, right? That's private, that's theirs. But with the internet and what they're exposed, there's so much, it's so public that I sort of lean more toward what, this idea that privacy, when it comes to social media or the internet, is not an entitlement, and I'm not sure at what age it becomes an entitlement. Maybe when they start to pay for it, or maybe when they've earned enough trust with you that you say, all right, you know what, I know that my kid is going to be okay handling themselves on social media.
But for me, it's not necessarily only about my kid, right? So when you have access to your kid's accounts and you look at them, it's not just about what your kid posts or what your kid does.
Yep.
But it's what's going on in the
I would say that I really appreciated, actually, I think one of the upsides of being an oversharer or somebody who doesn't freak out about stuff is that my kids will often talk to me about, I'm really concerned so-and-so posted this,
Right.
and, really want you to sort of intervene, which,
I was just going to say, one thing is the mom of triplets who just left 8th grade, started 9th grade, it all goes out the window in high school because you have to have Facebook to be on any club or whatever. You have to have social media. So that became a whole new thing where I've been saying no, no, no for so long. And then I just, oh, shoot, we're woefully behind that. We have to, it's a real eye-opener.
it's a very important point, and needing to have computer access during
So it's
school.
some sort of a limit. I don't know how to limit it anymore, actually. It's been hard.
I also have kids in high school, and although I'm obviously a girl, and they're all boys, but the issue of the diary comes up a lot, where they'll say, like, well, you had a diary, did your parents read your diary? You had a right to privacy. But I always say to them, I didn't have a right to privacy in my diary. It was my diary, it was in my room, but if there was a reason that my parents needed to read it, if they thought that I was in danger or there was something going on that they needed to know to protect me, they had an ability to read it. They had access to it because it was in their house and I lived there. And I feel like the internet and what you do on the internet is the same way. However, I do have friends who read their children's texts, and they read, as a result, my children's texts. And as your children get older and older, it becomes an uncomfortable situation because there are things that kids, they don't have a right to privacy when it comes to breaking the law or hurting themselves, I feel like, but they might have a right to privacy about saying they have a crush on a girl. That's not something I need to be involved in, I feel like, or their feelings, their teenage feelings, teenagers need to communicate with each other, I feel like, and be private in their communication, just like I was.
Well, but that brings up, this might go in a different direction, but that brings up the issue of your digital footprint, right? So if you put something out there, not only can, you or another parent access it, but so can lots of other people. So it's really a matter of...
It can be forwarded, the picture can be taken, it can be sent. And I don't read my children's text messages, but I tell them, I could if I wanted to, because the technology is there, and so they should be aware that if they would be ashamed if I wrote something, they shouldn't write it. And that they should also know that every parent that they meet in this room might be reading everything they write. And so before they walk in somebody else's kitchen, they should know that their mother may already know all those things about them that I don't know, and maybe I don't even want to know. I'm like, don't tell me, I don't want to know that about him. That's his business.
Yeah,
But,
I
tell them, I'm like, you better know that your friends' moms might know. I don't know if they do or not, but they might,
I think there are times that, I have a niece who's 25, and she was up for a job with a government contractor, and on her Facebook page were all of her Friday night escapades with her friends with the lineup of drinks, you know. None of this, which I approve, but, you know, I'm an aunt, what can I do? Aside from say, you know, that's really not a good thing. Your potential employer's gonna look at your Facebook page. So you need to be really careful about what you put out there. And I think the same thing happens, particularly with high schoolers who are looking at colleges, that, you know, my guess is that some of these colleges are looking at Facebook pages and seeing kind of what these kids are doing. And so I think that if education is important in terms of letting youth know that once it gets out there, it's, you know, as politicians have found out, you know, it's fair game.
These high school kids, I remember when my son, who's a sophomore in college, was a senior, and everybody changed their Facebook names. So they think they're being very clever that way.
Yeah.
It's not that.
Just wanted to go back, people are adding stuff, I just wanted to say to Madeline's comment, because I thought that a part of it got glossed over, because I also am very expressive, and you mentioned, I don't know why it moves me, but you mentioned the guilt that you feel. And I think that's interesting, because I do think that you have the opportunity to go back to it was your son, you said, and to say, you know, gee, I feel like, you remember that time when X happened, and I feel like, you know, I don't know how, I know I was in deep distress, or however you want to present it, but I do feel like you could revisit that, because you said you were worried that you damaged him. And I do think that I think we all were, that's why we're here, because we want to figure out these things, and I just feel like, I do think you have the opportunity to revisit that and share with him how you are feeling now, where you're in a different place. And maybe he has some things to share with you about what frightened him or didn't frighten him, or how he felt about it. Or he might say, oh, you know, I saw you were hurting. You don't know what he's going to say. So I just think that, you know, in all these conversations that we have, I do think, because, you know, we're different, and I married a therapist, right? And so I obviously do it in a different way, right? So I do think that one of the things I've learned is that you do have the opportunity to nothing is done once and then over. We do have the opportunity to go back.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Can I ask a question? This has nothing to do with what you've been talking about social media, but we have a current situation in our family where my father-in-law is very ill, and it's not going to end well. And so I have a 12-year-old and a 9-year-old. The 12-year-old asks lots of questions, but I think he's processing it properly and appropriate for what I expect of him. The 9-year-old doesn't want to talk about it, doesn't have any questions, you know, he's been told. So I think my question is, what do you do when you think there should be more questions? Do you push it? Do you just let him do it on his time frame? Do we let this play out and leave it alone and let him come to us? Or should I be concerned that he's not inquiring more? Doesn't seem to want to talk about it more.
I'm going to jump in, and I'm just going to say I'm inclined to let him set the pace. Because kids are different, and they're made different, they have different temperaments, different experiences.
So just give him the basic facts and let him ask.
And if you have any further questions, you know, I totally want you to come and ask me, or your dad, or whoever else is, you know, around and say.
With that, I agree. With that said, if you have a sense that the not wanting to know is based on not wanting to feel upset, then you might even say something like that, or even just put out there that, you know, it can be really sad, and then leave it.
Yeah.
But because then you've done enough. You don't want to push beyond that. But I think that if you have a sense of that, because sometimes they need a little bit of an invitation to get to the feeling of it.
Because he's generally the emotional one,
Yeah.
and I'm not seeing any emotion at all. And my concern is that he's just not processing it. You know, he knows it, he hears it as a fact, but it doesn't yet have meaning for him.
Or he's processing it, and he's just not.
Death is a very scary thing for kids. And adults. Well, I mean, you know, there's no class in school about how do you deal with somebody who's dying, right? I mean, we don't get that kind of education. And we've moved death behind closed doors. That's another
Right,
that's another whole topic for
so true.
a different night. but not to talk about it. I mean, I think, to be able to say, I'm really sad about this to your son, and then see what he comes back with, or he may say, oh, mommy, I'm sorry that you're so sad, and but that's why I think it is so important to express our feelings, particularly when we're sad, because I think that, children don't often get that their parents are sad or can be sad.
Right. Thank you.
All right, any other questions? Any index cards floating around? Very open group, which is lovely.
Yeah, it's great.
Okay, I think you've already answered this question in some of the other answers, but I'm just going to put it out there in case there's anything else you wanted to add about it. So, as parents are having these discussions, how should they try to ease their children's anxiety and pass along important information in a constructive way without letting anger and bias and fear interfere with it? Is there a way to do that?
I think it's really important to, if you are having negative feelings, to really be able to process it with another adult you trust first before you talk to your kid.
And I think it's also important to name it, and to know what your hot buttons are, what's going to set you off, and then try to deal with that kind of separately before you then sit down with your child to talk about something. I do want to just point out, as we end, that there's a lot of wonderful resources online to help you. The National Child Traumatic Stress Network has some really excellent documents, and I think there are copies of some of them over on the table, and I encourage you to take them because they talk about the different age groups and what you can expect and some things you can do in terms of when there's either a trauma or a tragedy or some highly emotional situation that happens for you and your family, and it's by age, and gives you perhaps like some words to say, some what to look for when your child is going through something traumatic, and so I encourage you to just take those papers with you and just stick them in a drawer somewhere, knowing where they are so that you can use them, because they are really excellent resources.
Well, I want to say thank you to our panelists. This was, for me, it was a very enlightening discussion. And thank you to all of you for coming. I appreciate that. And have a good night.